All right, well, this talk is co-sponsored by the Center for Constitutional Liberty and the Honors Program. I'm Kevin Vance, the director of the Center for Constitutional Liberty, and we're really excited for our speaker tonight. And to introduce our speaker is going to be Dr. Traffas, co-director of the Honors Program.
This is a thrill for me. I was thinking as I was walking across the quad, it's very cold, that I've known Bill Allen for 40 years. I didn't actually meet him for the first year or two that I was in graduate school because he was away in France. It's hard to say all the accomplishments that he has had throughout his marvelous life. I am proud to be a student. I studied with him at Claremont McKenna, or not McKenna. Well, he was actually at Harvey Mudd, the place where they ride around in unicycles and study physics. That's what they do. And they were smart enough to get him to teach them about the American regime. So he's a Montesquieu scholar. He is absolutely preeminent in his field in understanding the founding. I absolutely learned a lot from him, both in the classroom and outside the classroom. The wonderful thing about graduate school that we had, and should you go to graduate school, I hope you get, which is that we were like a family. We were in our professors' homes. I had the great privilege of being tapped to babysit the children. And it was a hardship because they had bought us tickets to see Fox, Mass, and D minor. So it was really, really rough going. But anyway, I just can't wait till you get to hear from him. And I wish that COVID hadn't happened, so we would have had him here. But there are some of you that are new to the college, so you wouldn't have had the privilege of getting to hear him. I look forward to seeing him talk to you. And I'm bad tech. Do I turn it off?
Thank you so much, Susan, and greetings to all of you. I am very much regret that I am not with you as we had originally tried to accomplish. But the fact of the matter is, we all have to bow to reality. And I am at least grateful that God has granted us the opportunity to visit in this virtual manner. We didn't know when we organized a virtual visit that after 3 years of successfully evading COVID, that during the holidays, my wife and I would play COVID round robin for 3.5 weeks. So we are well and recovered now. But had we not planned it, it would have turned out this way anyway. So we are here, and we're here to talk about George Washington. We're here to talk about civil liberty, religious liberty, human rights. We're here really to talk about the record. But before I do that, I just have to acknowledge Dr. Traffas and the work that she has done, not only at Benedictine, but throughout her career, and express my appreciation for all that she has meant, not just to me and our family of students of political philosophy, but for a wide audience beyond ourselves and beyond Benedictine. She's been instrumental in helping to formulate public policies in a very important dimension of our life. And she's written important works, which I certainly want to call to your attention and ask you to take the time to read and understand. But having said all that, I know that our time is precious, and I don't want to go unduly long in making a presentation. I am going to spend some time talking to you, but I also want to have good time for questions and answers. And I'm looking at the setup, and I can see now that you'll be able to raise questions, at least if they're moderated by someone from the podium, so I can hear them clearly. And so we will take them in turn after I speak for a little while about George Washington, about America, and about how it is we ought to understand these things. And this is especially important today. So let me give you some context before I dive into the meat of the subject. There is a great debate among us today as to exactly how to understand the founding. And that debate has to do with the question of whether we are to take the founding seriously and to take instruction from it, or whether we ought to turn our backs to it and strike on a different course. And the best way for me to try to illustrate to you why that is significant is to show what's at stake, what we stand to gain or lose doing one thing or the other. There's a story I recently encountered that helps convey this about a very old man who was reaching a point in his life when he no longer had the vigor to perform the kind of task he once performed. He loved to garden, and towards the end of every winter, he looked forward to breaking up the hard ground and laying out his new garden. But he reached the point now where he could not break up the frozen ground. And he wrote a rueful letter to his son who happened to be in prison, explaining to him how much he missed him because his son would always be there to help him. And he imagined that this year he would simply have to live without a garden. The son wrote back after a day or two and said, Dad, whatever you do, don't dig up the garden. That's where the bodies are buried. A day or two later, there was a knock on the door and a warrant. And officers came and dug up the entire backyard. They found no body. A day or two later, he got another letter from his son in prison saying, Dad, you can garden now. Now, that story may strike you as a bit far-fetched in application to the founding, but consider, it's actually the application of a very old fable. It wasn't probably recognized by some of the people who have repeated it recently, but there was a fable from Aesop's time about the farmer who had several sons whom he wanted to inspire to perform, and he told them there was a treasure buried in the yard. And being young and somewhat avaricious, they set about digging up the treasure all over the yard and never found it. They were very unhappy with the father who had misled them, until when the harvest came in, and it was richer, more bountiful than they had ever known. And then they got the point. Now, if you put those two stories together, you can begin to see what I mean when I say we have to figure out what's at stake and asking the question of whether to dig up the past or whether to bury it. For those who tell us to bury the past also ask us to forego the treasures of the past that we can crop, or the fruit that we can pick for ourselves. So we go back to George Washington in the spirit that we can expect, if we are dutiful and are willing to work hard enough, we too can uncover buried treasures. Let's start at the beginning. I'm going to read something to you. I published a book of George Washington's writings. It's called George Washington, A Collection. And in it, I include many things, all of which I recommend to your attention, because there's no better way to understand George Washington than through his own words. And I want to share with you in particular right now, words from his farewell address in 1796, when he's retiring. Not the first of his retirements, by the way, and I'll come back to that later, but he's retiring once and for all, as he imagined. And he says this towards the end of that address. It's a long address. It's a critically important address. We're not going to do an analysis of the address this evening, but I want you to hear this. Though in reviewing the incidents of my administration, I am unconscious of intentional error, I am nevertheless too sensible of my defects not to think it probable that I may have committed many errors. Whatever they may be, I fervently beseech the Almighty to avert or mitigate the evils to which they may tend. I shall also carry with me the hope that my country will never cease to view them with indulgence, and that after 45 years of my life dedicated to its service, with an upright zeal, the faults of incompetent abilities will be consigned to oblivion, as myself must soon be to the mansions of rest. Now, it can fairly be said that George Washington, who in this moment is, of course, anticipating not only the end of his service, but the end of his life, that this is someone who spun out his thread to the very end of the spool, unbroken. But what he said in this passage, and I want you to focus on, are just these few words. After 45 years of my life dedicated to its service. And I want you to perform the mathematics. This was 1796 he wrote that, which means he's referring to what? 1751, 45 years earlier. George Washington was born in 1732, the New Style calendar, February the 22nd. So how old was he in 1796 or in 1751? In 1751, he was 19 years old. In 1796, he was 64. He said he spent the time from his 19th year of age through the next 45 years dedicated to his country's service. Now, I beg you to reflect that the United States as a country did not exist in 1751, nor in 1761, nor in 1771, and that it only really came into existence in 1776 with the Declaration of Independence, which means you have to try to understand what he's talking about. Why does he refer to my country in the singular and dates it from his 19th year of age? You might say he was a mere boy. Say you'd be reluctant to say that about yourselves. So let's grant him manhood, if we will. But a very young man, to be sure. A young man who has done what? For 45 years, worked toward the founding of the most important civilization ever founded in the history of the world. Now that should put it in perspective for you. This is an enormous work, which he at the end of his life is making the claim he was bent on from the beginning of his life. Now, to be sure, throughout Washington's career, he gave thanks to Providence for all that happened and being the inventing and guiding hand through the whole process. He nevertheless is claiming a degree of conscious effort and self-awareness, which is important for us to take in and then breathe, as it were, the gravity of in this context. It is not an accident that this man was seen by the people who knew him, among whom he walked and who worked with him, as eminent beyond expectation. We often think that in retrospect, Washington has been apotheosized. He's been turned into something greater than human, turned into something beyond our expectations or conceptions. But when we say that, we're failing to reflect what the people who knew him said about him. If you were to go back and read the many hundreds of eulogies that appeared at the time of his death in 1799, you would see they spoke even more extravagantly about him than anything you've ever heard anyone of our own time say. So that it may be useful for us not to try to second guess the past, but to spend quality time simply listening to the past, allowing it to speak for itself. To ask, for example, why it was Archbishop Carroll, the first papally appointed archbishop in North America, in his eulogy of Washington, celebrated him above all, most prominently, for Washington's contribution to establishing religious freedom. And that's what Bishop Carroll did at that moment, and was not alone. And what was the foundation for that? Well, one of the foundations of that would be something that Washington said before he closed the war in 1783 in his general orders to his troops. And I'm going to share that passage with you. It comes from the general orders of April 18th, 1783, where George Washington said, "For happy, thrice happy shall they be pronounced hereafter, who have contributed anything, who have performed the meanest office in erecting this stupendous fabric of freedom and empire on the broad basis of independence, who have assisted in protecting the rights of humane nature and establishing an asylum for the poor and oppressed of all nations and religions. That's what he wrote to his army in 1783, before the peace treaty had been signed, but when they knew the war was closing because it was well after the battle at Yorktown. The general says, you soldiers, patriots, are actually creating a new civilization that will be an asylum for the poor and oppressed of all nations and religions. He dedicated the country to a mission. Now, you would say, well, have we lived up to that mission? I would say that's a premature question. That's refusing to dig up the backyard to find the treasure. The question is not, have we lived up to it? Did we ever live up to it? Might we yet live up to it? The question is, has it had a sustaining influence in shaping the course of this country? And the answer is yes. Every bit as much as we see in 1792 in his letter to the Hebrew congregation at Newport, where he says, we believe that there is no sanction to be given to bigotry. And he reiterated that over and again. He reiterated it with respect to Catholics, as Bishop Carroll acknowledged, with respect to Muslims, with respect to Jews, with respect to everyone. Now, for us, these things sound like commonplaces. They're strewn through our laws, court opinions, and textbooks. Washington did not say these things when they were commonplaces. Washington thought independently. Washington arrived at the understanding without having the direction of consensual opinion to pose for him what is acceptable and what is not. He arrived at it through judgment, prudent judgment. Now, that prudent judgment, as it seems to me, is reflected in that self-consciousness of what he spent 45 years doing. It wasn't simply building a country, any country like another country. It was a country which led him in 1782 when he wrote to the Baptist congregation in New York and said, the motive that induced me to take the field was civil and religious liberty. That was his motive. And when do you suppose that motive took root in his soul? Much earlier than 1776. Why? Because he went off to the Second Continental Congress that was going to measure about war and non-war and independence in 1775, wearing his uniform. And as his wife testified, when he left home, he was resolved to do the utmost. Moreover, he had given indication of this 10 years earlier. And you will appreciate this story. It is humorous and at the same time very serious. His wife, Martha, was a Dandridge. She was a widow. And at the time he married her, she had long been in correspondence with an uncle who was an English aristocrat in England. But after the marriage, that correspondence had ceased. But in 1764, George Washington took it upon himself to write to his uncle to inquire why he no longer wrote to his niece. That was at least the surface reason for the letter. And it was all very polite and proper. But the greater bulk of the letter, the heart of the letter, was a protest of what was happening in England, in Parliament, and at the Crown, that he saw as oppressive. And he was giving a word of warning, as well as invoking an aristocrat in England to do something to change this before it was too late, in which he completely threatens that the United States, the colonists themselves, it was not yet the United States, would not surrender their liberty. In short, we can trace the moments from the time he was serving as a colonel in the Virginia militia. Remember, he's the man who started the 7 Years' War in the minds of all Europe, for he fired the first shot, which the French call an assassination of their ambassador, that got the war going. He therefore he was already committed to defense, first of course, the colony of Virginia in the Western Territories, but those Western Territories at that time were ill-defined and extended as far as Pittsburgh and Ohio River and other parts. So which means it engulfed what became, in a sense, the heart of the new nation. He was invested in that project from 19 years of age. Now, he led his troops in such a way that he led them to express extraordinary confidence in him. And it was that kind of confidence that sustained throughout the course of his career that led him into the various positions where he was repeatedly placed in authority while himself disclaiming any real talent for it. And we can talk about that later, why he did that. But nevertheless, until eventually he was being unanimously chosen to serve as, of course, chair or president of the Constitutional Convention in 1787, and ultimately president of the United States. Now, over the course of these many things, there are moments, there are decisive moments, there are critical moments in which Washington actually provides moral leadership for the country, not merely the significantly symbolic leadership of a stalwart military veteran who was making decisions in the heat of battle, all of which was important. There are some people who say, by the way, that Washington never won a battle until the Battle of Yorktown at the end of the war. That's false. That's not. Or they say he never won a battle until the Christmas battle where he defeated the Hessians. No, that's not true. He just Boston at the start of the war. Yes, he did a lot of running, tactical running after that. And what did that running achieve? It kept the army alive until the moment of victory. So we must see in Washington someone who made decisions, who achieved things, who accomplished things, and then add to that someone who provided moral direction. That moral direction nowhere manifests itself so profoundly as it does in his 1783 circular address. And that's the last text I'm going to point you to. I'll invite you to read it. It's too long for me to read. I'm just going to characterize it. Excuse me. That address, of course, is written in June of 1783. And Washington himself, now still commanding general, refers to this as political legacy. It's a letter addressed to the 13 state governors and their people. In other words, he sends it to the governors and he expects them to share it with the public. In that long letter, he has a number of themes which are important. We can't develop them all. There are themes about justice. There are themes about political stability. There's themes about national security, themes about what it means to take on the responsibility of self-government. And in the course of discussing all these themes, he says a couple of things that are extremely important to us in trying to understand the moral leadership that Washington was bringing. I'm going to share you just one of those to start with, and then a final one. He says, foundation of our empire was not laid in the gloomy age of ignorance and superstition, but at an epoch when the rights of mankind were better understood and more clearly defined than at any former period. The researches of the human mind after social happiness have been carried to a great extent. The treasures of knowledge acquired through a long succession of years by the labors of philosophers, sages, and legislators are laid open for our use. And their collective wisdom may be happily applied in the establishment of our forms of government. The free of letters, the unbounded extension of commerce, the progressive refinement of manners, the growing liberality of sentiment, and above all, the pure and benign light of revelation have had ameliorating influence on mankind and increased the blessings of society. At this auspicious period, the United States came into existence as a nation, and if their citizens should not be completely free and happy, the fault will be entirely their own. Now, it's in this, then, that we see the core of Washington's moral leadership. Washington interprets self-government, not as we have lazily come to do, as mere democratic procedure. He interpreted self-government as the personal responsibility of each to govern him or herself. It was a principle of moderation or virtue Washington was describing when he described self-government. And here he is offering a catechism as the commander of the army to the whole country, a catechism which he calls his political legacy, in order to instill precisely that degree of appreciation in the country. And we must ask ourselves, are we really confident that we would have the strong confidence in self-government, in democracy, in republicanism that we have, had it not been for Washington's moral leadership? That's the question we need to ask of ourselves. And we can only answer that question by going back, listening to Washington, listening to the people around him, seeing how they judged it, and then asking whether we can make sense of those judgments. We can't do that retrospectively from the perspective of what we happen to think we believe, because our beliefs are perverted. Let's be candid about that. They, over time, all kinds of rust and corrosion will This was a moment of rupture in human history, in the whole of human history. In doing remarks, commentary for a recent production, a forthcoming production really from Gingrich Productions on immigration, and Alexis de Tocqueville's appreciation of it, I made the observation that what you have to understand is the founding of the United States was a rupture, not simply with Great Britain, but with all of human history, placing the United States on a path that broke open the gloom of all the past, that shone a light brightly upon human prospects, a light illuminated, as Washington so frequently repeated, by divine providence. So it is in that context that I bring before you then Washington, defender of civil liberty, religious liberty, and human rights. And you must rightly ask of me, are you serious? Have you not heard what we've all heard, repeated again and again, that Washington was a slaveholder? Not merely a slaveholder, but someone who would hold slaves his entire life and only free them when he dies, use them up and let them go. That's the impression you're given. Could he have been serious? And you will see, you can read books that pretend that he may even have fathered children upon slave women, or that he was a ruthless slave master who went out of his way to reclaim runaway slaves. The stories are legion. A brand new book called The American Inheritance by Edward Lawson tells the story in that way. It's a false story. That's why I say you must go back and you must read yourself in order to see this. You can see, for example, if you go to the National Constitution Center, an exhibit that's in Philadelphia of a woman called Oni Judge, who was a runaway, which tells the false story, i.e. Oni, who was a dowry slave, meaning she belonged to Martha from prior to the marriage, ultimately, not to George, and who was basically Martha's domestic in the house and very close to her. Oni had run away while they were in Philadelphia. And they tell the story of Oni not only running away, but successfully evading capture, though Washington did everything possible to try to get her back. That's to make Oni heroic and Washington devilish. But that's not the way it happened. The way it happened is Oni did leave. She was free to come and go in Philadelphia. Martha suspected, and George therefore also, that she was enticed by a Frenchman who was too good looking and too seductive and led away. But whatever the reasons for, and we don't have to accept that explanation of it, anybody could desire freedom and leave, even when they were treated well, as it appears Oni certainly was. But she went away and she was fairly quickly traced to New Hampshire. And Washington engaged the efforts of a number of people to get her to return to Mount Vernon. But he specifically instructed them not to force it. If she were going to return, she was going to have to return of her own will. And it's not that he couldn't have reverted to slave catchers the way people did. They'd already been doing that. They did that in Boston, not just to recover runaway slaves. They would snatch free Black people off the streets of Boston and sell them into slavery in the Caribbean in the 1780s already. This happened to people who were associated with Prince Hall and the Prince Hall Masonic lodges there in Boston. Slave catchers were always available to be hired for those purposes. Washington never hired slave catchers. He specifically asked the people who were assisting him not to do that sort of thing. And he never got Oni Judge back. She did not successfully escape. He traced her down. They had conversations with her. She even made a proposal to come back if he would free her in his will. And that produces the ultimate irony, right? Because we know he did free all the slaves in his will, all the slaves that, as he put it in the will, who died when he died, who were in his possession, because he didn't have control over the dower slaves, which she would have been one. But he declined that offer, not for that reason, but because of the effect it would have had on all the other slaves, the dower slaves and his slaves, as a dispiriting effect. And he preferred to let her go. But he did that because this lasted from basically early 1796 to almost 1799. He did that while he was shaping his final will, in which he provided for the freedom of all the slaves. So we say, well, it's true that at least that much, that he freed the slaves only when he died and not before. Well, he did offer freedom to William, who was with him in the war for 8 years, at the end of the war, as a reward for his services. He did not free slaves prior to that. But here's what's non-contextual in this argument. The problem is that George Washington knew how little value lay in telling people they were free to go in the midst of a society where they were not welcome and where they had not the means to provide for themselves. Accordingly, he took it as his mission to repair his estate and his finances to the point that he could not just free, but provide for the slaves when he did so. And remember, he spent 8 years fighting a war during which he spent only 2 nights at home. The management of his property was remote. He spent another 8 years in the presidency. He was home often during that 8 years, but he was still not directly tending to his fortune. And he had the brief space between 1796 and his death in December of 1799, when he was back at Mount Vernon, to put it all back together sufficiently to command the means to be able to provide for the people he was going to liberate. So those who judge him adversely judge him non-contextually. They're not paying attention to the frequent references he makes to wishing to see slavery abolished, believing, to be sure, it needed to be done legislatively. It couldn't just be done by fiat. Things must be done lawfully, or they do not sustain. They do not have the impact one desires for them. But this is the way in which Washington led his life. And I could give you innumerable examples that illustrate him not only providing moral lessons, and not only exercising prudent judgment, but providing examples through his own life that had a seminal influence in the development of this nation. So as we go back, as we plow through these ancient writings as they are now to us, one of the things we discover in the digging up is that there are fresh harvests to be collected. Now I want to pause there, and I want you to ask questions.
Hello. Um, Hi. In your opinion, based on all of, you talked about the misconceptions of Washington, especially today, what would be the most important misconception you'd want to correct past the slave ownership thing that you just talked about for today, especially when coming into confrontation with people who want to bash Washington?
Oh, that's a wonderful question, and I thank you for asking it. The thing that I would most want to focus on today is the misimpression that George Washington was an empty symbol. Now, let me say something about this. That's widespread. And long ago, when I was your age and studying, it was really a fairly prevailing impression that Washington was not very bright and he didn't contribute very much. Because the real founders were the so-called intellectuals, the Madisons, the Jeffersons, the Hamiltons, the Adams, and Washington simply didn't rank among them. And I told you, I published this work of George Washington. This is a one-volume collection of his writings. His writings fill more than 100 volumes. They're not treatises, they're correspondence, they're diary entries, they're all kinds of things. His writings are more elaborate than those of any of the other founders. They contain more intelligence and more insight than any of the other founders. But it is George Washington himself, I must tell you, who is responsible for that revisionist misimpression, because he always denied that he knew anything. I always argued he was being Socrates. You remember Socrates, all that I know is that I know nothing. Well, Washington was the expert at saying that. And others, frankly, took it too literally. Yes, he was a man of genuine modesty and humility. I don't deny that. But he was much more. And how does this come out? You see it in the administration of the government. There you discover. In the army, we see it in a different way, and you expect it on the military. But in the administration of the government, establishing a cabinet and dealing with the Congress, we saw him exercise arts of prudent delegation and decisive decision. He never hesitated to make a decision he had to make. He never made a decision he could force others to make. His being modest and humble was part of ensuring that the instruments of self-government would work. And that's why in his first inaugural address, he said to Congress, I'm not going to tell you what to do. That's for you to decide. But of course, he was right there whenever the time came, a decision had to be made to make a firm decision and shape the path. So the misimpression that he was not in control, that's the biggest misimpression. Even someone as dear to me as Forrest McDonald, a very famous and highly gifted historian, made that mistake. That's I would want people to correct.
Thank you.
Hello, sir. I'd like to start off by thanking you for your influence on Dr. Traffas. She's an amazing professor, and she's had a very profound impact on my own life. So I've heard it said that there was a Masonic influence and a Hegelian influence on many of the founders. Would you say that's correct?
I would say several of the founders were Masons. None of them were Hegelians. That would be anachronistic.
Oh, thank goodness.
Hegel was later than the development of the founders and the development of their thinking. It's not to say there's not some relationship between the rationalistic thinking you find in Hegel, but what you don't find in any of the founders, which eventuates in Marxism following Hegel, is this kind of determinism that drives the rejection of science in the 19th century. That's not part of the founding. There's a part of the Enlightenment, and we see it characterized in Thomas Jefferson more than anyone else. Jefferson was subject to being seduced by what I call the Second Enlightenment. The First Enlightenment, the Enlightenment that really is in the period of the encyclopedia in the 18th century, the early Enlightenment. The Second Enlightenment comes later, towards the end, around the period of the physiocrats and the French Revolution eventually. The First Enlightenment is predicated on the principle of openness, and it is not constructivist. The Second Enlightenment is we can remake the world. It is informed partially by some Rousseauian speculation and some Kantian notions in a manner of speaking, but that we can remake the world, that form of the Enlightenment did not infect the founders in that sense because they didn't think of remaking human nature. That second Enlightenment thought you could take human nature at hand and reshape it. The founders worked with human nature, not trying to reshape human nature. It is not true, as some people taught when I was in school and studying political theory, that the founders believed human nature was evil. As we see in the Federalist Paper number 51, the end of civil society is justice, and men will always pursue justice. Well, that can't be consistent with the idea of human nature being evil. And that was James Madison, the one from whom they take in Federalist 10 the presumed notion that human nature is fundamentally evil. So the founders did not fall into this idea of human plasticity to be reshaped. What they did prior to the Second Enlightenment coming to dominate the world was to establish the possibility that there was sufficient virtue in human beings for self-government to work. And so what you do is you go back to the Declaration of Independence, and you see that what is meant there when we repeat and limn the phrase that all men are created equal, and they're endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And in order to secure these rights, and go on to the very end of the sentence, because it's all one sentence, what's at the heart of it is precisely the idea of informed consent. And informed consent is only possible for people who are capable of moderation. People who have no control over their passions, whose reasons will not control their appetites, can never give informed consent anything. What the Declaration is affirming is that virtually all human beings are capable of moderation, which is virtue sufficient to be self-governing. That's what the heart of the first Enlightenment is about. That's what the American founding is about.
Thank you.
Hello. I was wondering what you thought Washington would think about the evolution of the Constitution, specifically with women's rights today.
Well, I would not put upon Washington the burden of making an assessment of whether we have been wise or foolish in some changes that we've made. I would leave that for us to hash out among ourselves, looking for the inspiration of Washington's guidance. But I will tell you this, Washington gave an inaugural, a first inaugural, when the Constitution was put in operation, right? But before that formal inaugural address, he had a draft inaugural that was much longer. And he said two things in that address that are very important. He says, I have studied this thing from top to bottom. He literally said this. You can't believe a man would stand up and say this, but he did. He said, I've studied this from top to bottom. I've read everything that's been published on the question. He said it. He said it himself, believe me or not. I know what is out there and what went into shaping this Constitution. And listen to me, better still may not be devised. He said that. He actually said that. But what did he mean by it? Well, he said a second thing there, the thing he repeated in the actual first inaugural that he delivered, which is to say, there is a process for amending when errors are discovered. And I leave it to you to decide what those errors might be and how they should be corrected. Moreover, I want you to remember something he said. The people ratified this instrument only after we promised them that we would add a Bill of Rights to it. So I want you to remember to satisfy that commitment, that promise. In other words, Washington started the government with the recognition that it's a wonderful piece of work subject to ongoing revision.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you for being here. My question had to do with Washington's views on religious liberty and specifically the relationship between religion and government. So I'd heard that some of the founders, like Jefferson, were a little more inclined to separate religion totally from government. Whereas Washington seems to have a bit of a more nuanced view on that. He certainly doesn't believe in a theocracy per se, as in church leaders are running the government, but he does seem to be okay with more church involvement in the government, public prayer, things like that. And I was wondering how that would have influenced our nation's founding and our development and our understanding of religious liberty.
Well, I'm going to have to read something to you if you're going to ask me that question. So give me a moment to turn to it.
Sure.
And I will share with you the answer to your question in his words. It's the end of that 1783 circular address, which I shared with you a portion of, right? This is the final paragraph, and I want you to listen to this very carefully. I'm going to read it slowly. I now make it my earnest prayer that God would have you and the state over which you preside in his holy protection, that he would incline the hearts of the citizens to cultivate a spirit of subordination and obedience to government, to entertain a brotherly affection and love for one another, for their fellow citizens of the United States at large, and particularly for their brethren who have served in the field. And finally, that he would most graciously be pleased to dispose us all to do justice, to love mercy, and to demean ourselves with that charity, humility, and pacific temper of mind, which were the characteristics of the divine author of our blessed religion. And without an humble imitation of whose example in these things, we can never hope to be a happy nation. It's pretty explicit, isn't it? And you recognize the references, right? You recognize the reference to Micah 6:8. What does your God ask of you, O man, but to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly? And notice how he amends the final clause, to walk humbly. I'll reread it to you. To demean ourselves with that charity, humility, and pacific temper of mind, which are the characteristics of the divine author of our blessed religion. In other words, walking humbly means following Christ. That's the divine author of our blessed religion. So, from his lips to your ears, to all our hearts.
Great. Thank you so much.
Good evening, and thank you for the talk. So that being said too, what was Washington's given we're a Catholic college and I myself am Catholic, what was just Washington's personal relationship with Catholicism?
Washington had not a personal relationship with Catholicism, he had a personal relationship with Catholics. Remember, a carol was one of the signs of the Declaration of Independence. So there are people with whom Washington interacted. Bishop Carroll, as I pointed out, had high appreciation for his, George Washington's relationship with Catholics. But George Washington was himself what I suppose generally we would call an Episcopalian, or perhaps even an Anglican, but we can say Episcopalian. He held a pew there in the church in Alexandria, Virginia. So his religious bearing was never something that he intruded upon others from a denominational or sectarian perspective. Nevertheless, one of the first orders he gave to the army in 1775 was to observe chapel every Sunday, every single week, that the troops had to be brought into chapel. And he didn't dictate whether it was this or that kind of presiding religious official, just that there be chapel and that people worship regularly. And so I think that's the best way to understand his relationship, whether to Catholics or others. Namely, he encouraged religious performance and not mere religious conviction. We can say of those founders who may be thought to be somewhat more tepid or weaker in this regard, and who therefore try to resolve all religious opinion into the general opinion or general sense of conscience, that they were less emphatic than George Washington was about the necessity of religious faith. But that's not to deny that the freedom of conscience is the bedrock even of that consent of the governed and that self-governing that I talked about before. And remember what James Madison said about that in his memorial and remonstrance in 1785, as he battled against religious assessments in the state of Virginia. He said, look, we all owe a duty to God before we owe any duty to civil society. And George Washington understood that. That's why he said the motive that induced him to take the field was civil and religious liberty. So I would say his relationship with Catholics was not doctrinal. It was generally an appreciation of the importance of religious faith itself.
And of course, I've also heard that George Washington converting to Catholicism on his deathbed's also been a myth too. So I guess. Yeah,
Oh,
he
that's
didn't have
completely a
any-
myth.
Yeah,
That's as much
what I
a
thought.
myth.
That's what I
as
thought.
much- that's as much as a myth as to say that his being a Mason made him anti-religious. It did not.
So he basically loved religious liberty, but never considered becoming a Catholic himself. Okay.
That's correct. Yeah.